Hi, Andrew from SACS. Different organisations and different individuals have different types of interview questions which they like and they believe in. Now, if you look at these questions, they generally fit into one of two categories. Questions about the past, which are often called behavioural interview questions, where you're going to ask somebody about a particular experience or something that they did in the past that gives you confidence that they can do whatever is required in this job. That's category number one. Category number two is what you might call scenario questions, where you're going to ask people about some theoretical scenario and you're going to judge whether they can do this job based on how they answer the theoretical scenario. Fascinating question. Which of them is better? Well, we're going to show you the evidence for this in this video, but first, let's talk about the benefit of structuring interviews. This is the result of decades of research into what works in recruitment, and what's been done here is that people have been assessed on a range of different things. Those are these characteristics on the left, and then down the track, people have gone back and got measures of success or failure, and then they have correlated it. That's what the validity means. Correlated the things that were assessed before the person was hired, and then come back and seen whether they succeed or fail. And what you see, things like age are particularly weak because there's a correlation of 0 with ultimate success. Fans of statistics, who probably are very few people watching this video, but fans of statistics will know that 0 means no correlation, and no correlation means that it's not an accurate measure. The higher the correlation, the better the measure. And you'll see that we've color-coded the things that are to do with psych testing, and you'll see that out of the top 10 or something, the vast majority of them, all apart from structured interviews, are to do with psych testing, which is why organisations all over the world psych test. But you'll notice that we have structured interviews at 0.51 validity, which is not bad, and you have unstructured interviews at 0.35. So that really raises the question, what is a structure in an interview? The best and simplest way of structuring an interview is to understand what the outcomes are that a particular job needs to achieve. So for instance, if the job has a customer service component, what you'll then do is you'll ask questions that relate to that capability of delivering customer service. Now you can do that in two ways. One is you could say, give us an example of where you've provided excellent customer service in the past. And the second is the future-based approach. Imagine the following: somebody's a difficult customer, what would you do to solve that problem? So that will help you to get to be a structured interview rather than an unstructured interview. But there's a couple of other things that can really help. Another thing that helps in structuring interviews is a simple scoring system and an agreed scoring system. So where you've got your question, you'll agree with your fellow panelists what a good answer is, and you'll rate those on often a 5-point Likert scale, where at this end of the scale you've got extremely favourable answer, neither favourable nor unfavourable, unfavourable and extremely unfavourable. Simply building a scoring system, but especially if you agree with your colleagues what a good answer is, that can be really powerful to assist. So recording the data in that way and comparing candidates can also aid in the structure of an interview process. But that still leaves the key question: which form of interview question works best? In 2002, Taylor and Small published the results of a meta-analysis into what works best: questions about the past or questions about the theoretical future. So what's a meta-analysis? A meta-analysis is where a researcher goes back to multiple studies that have been undertaken in the past addressing a particular question, pulls all of those studies together, screens these studies very heavily to make sure that we're talking apples and apples so that the studies are comparable, and then reanalyzes all of the data. What we see here is that both types of questions work more or less, but behavioural questions have been found to be substantially more effective, correlation of 0.63 versus 0.47. Now that's a pretty significant difference in its own right, but in fact the difference is a little bit more significant because what this study demonstrated is that the scenario questions, what would you do in this situation, they in fact correlated reasonably heavily with cognitive ability. In other words, if you're psych testing somebody and you've got their cognitive ability scores, the incremental validities, how much better your interview process will be if you add this in, is not as much as it would be with a behavioural interview question. Behavioural interview questions don't seem to correlate quite as highly with cognitive ability. Now that's a fascinating thing in its own right, and I guess what it means is that smarter people make stuff up better. But think of it this way: if you're asking somebody about a concrete example from their past, you're asking them to tell you about how they've dealt with something, and you might also toss in, what did you learn? But that's far more verifiable in a way. If you ask somebody about the question of what would you do in a certain situation, what you're tending to do is identify the characteristic of being a skillful interviewee, perhaps more so than being a skillful employee. So that's a weakness of scenario questions. Example questions, it is very simple to say, here's a situational or a scenario type question about financial management of an organisation, whereas the behavioural interview question is really, where have you done this in the past? Another fascinating finding from this meta-analysis is that I think when people ask behavioural interview questions, they're worried about the dimensions of experience that the person might have in their past. So let's say it's a nursing job and this person's just a trainee nurse, so they've never been a nurse. Can you really ask behavioural interview questions? Well, this meta-analysis actually addressed that question. And it turns out that if you ask these behavioural interview questions and say something like, or draw from your wider experience to answer this, in fact, it doesn't seem to ruin the predictive validity of the questions at all. They stand up pretty well. So if people understand what it is that the job includes and what they'll have to do in the job, then in fact, they can draw from broader experience to flesh out the answers, even if they haven't done exactly what's required. And in any event, many of the things that you're going to ask about, like let's say leadership capability or capabilities in finance management or whatever, can be drawn from a range of different experiences, school, perhaps part-time jobs, those kinds of things. Fascinating stuff. So, questions about the past work far better than questions about the future. But I know that won't stop certain people loving those questions. If you're interested in knowing a little bit more about the science of recruitment and perhaps availing yourself of some of the tools that we offer our clients, click on the link near this video or come to the SACS website and we'll look after you.